To analyze what really the report of the AAIB, the preliminary report really means, what are its implications, joining us now is a top aviation lawyer. James Healy-Pratt is aviation partner in Keystone Law, London. Thanks so much for joining us on Times Now, Mr. Pratt. The AAIB has released its 15-page preliminary report on the Air India crash that occurred in Ahmedabad on the 12th of June. While it's still an early assessment, it doesn't offer much insight into what the root cause is. What is your interpretation of the findings so far?
Well, the good thing is that the preliminary report has removed about 90% of the various theories and speculation that has surrounded this tragedy over the past month. So we know the focus is now on the history of the fuel control levers and also what happened in that cockpit during the last 20 seconds of the flight. So the families that we're helping and advising and looking after have a little more clarity, but they still want further answers to some serious questions that we say Air India and Boeing need to provide.
Now, what the preliminary report says is that both engines' fuel cutoff switches were moved from the run to the cutoff position. What could cause both these fuel cutoff switches to move simultaneously or within a second's gap, if I'm not mistaken, during the takeoff?
Well, we know there was a history of problems with the fuel cutoff switches. In 2018, the American safety regulator, the FAA, issued an airworthiness bulletin. Remarkably, they considered that there were issues with the latch mechanism, the locking mechanism of these levers, but they didn't consider that that was unsafe. But they were aware that certain Boeing operators had switches which had been incorrectly installed, and that meant that the fuel switches could be inadvertently knocked, which of course in a lot of people's view is unsafe.
Right.
Anyhow, Air India did not decide to follow that bulletin, and we know there's a history with those switches. The other thing, of course, is that there could be an electrics issue. We just don't know. More work needs to be done on precisely how those switches in that aircraft were functioning and how they could have been turned off, because as we all know, there's no good reason why those fuel cutoff switches should have been taken from run to cutoff.
Is it even possible under normal circumstances, especially if the aircraft had been properly pre-checked as part of the SOP, is there any possibility of a mechanical failure? There's also talk of a software glitch. What is your view?
I think it's possible, and we just need to have more information. I mean, one of the things that our families want us to do is to get detailed answers to these areas of concern. And don't forget, the families are excluded from the safety investigation. That's because of laws going back over 80 years to 1944, where the families are excluded. The families aren't happy about that. They want more information. One of the ways that we will be getting more information is that we will be filing a lawsuit against Boeing in the United States courts very soon, so that we can conduct a deep dive into the history of those faulty fuel switches and the relationship between Boeing and their US regulator.
And Mr. Pratt, while nothing is really conclusive, but is there any plausible explanation for why an experienced pilot would cut off fuel switches during such a critical phase of the flight? Because there are many who are rushing into conclusions, but does that theory hold any water at all?
In our view, and according to our technical experts, there are no good reasons to be cycling the fuel switches at that critical stage of flight.
And as per the preliminary report, the engine 1 and engine 2 fuel cutoff switches transition from run to cutoff after a time gap of 1 second. How common is it for both engines to shut down in such close succession, and what redundancy measures exist to prevent a total power loss in a Boeing 787-8 aircraft?
Well, that's quite a complicated question, and you need to kind of cut it down into simpler bits. I mean, it is very rare almost vanishingly small for a twin-engined aircraft like the Boeing 787 to suffer a simultaneous double-engine failure. And what we do know is that the fuel that was driving those engines, some of it was tested and it was satisfactory. So if it's not fuel, then you start to look at the fuel supply and you start to look at the fuel switches. And we know there has been a history of problems with those switches.
At the same time, the same report notes that there are no defects that have been found in the fuel switch design since 2023. It also points out that there are certain inspections related to the fuel switch lock which were issued as advisories. They were not mandatory directives. Now, these inspections were not carried out by Air India, as you rightly mentioned, but that's because they were not mandatory, which also you mentioned. But the larger question is, why were then they classified as an advisory rather than being a mandatory provision that should have been carried out?
That is a really good question, which is why was this historic problem with the switches that wouldn't lock properly classified as an advisory? That bulletin was issued by the American safety regulator in 2018. That was just after the Lion Air Boeing tragedy, and it was just before Ethiopian Airlines Boeing tragedy, and it was slap bang in the middle of the time when it is a recorded fact that Boeing had gained regulatory capture of the safety regulator, the FAA, which affected air safety and took innocent lives. So that's why our families are very interested in conducting a deep dive in the US courts against Boeing about exactly what went on back in 2017 and 2018 about these fuel cutoff switches.
Now, because this becomes a very important question, what you're mentioning, because there was a FAA 2018 warning that highlighted the risk of an inadvertent operation of the fuel cutoff switch. Do you then believe that enough was done by the manufacturer as well as the regulatory bodies to mitigate this risk that was known?
Well, that is an area of concern for the families that we're helping, and that's exactly why we are going to the US courts to obtain evidence from Boeing about the discussions that went on back in 2017, 2018 about these faulty fuel switches and the relationship between Boeing and the safety regulator, the FAA. It's really important we get to the bottom of this.
There was a question that arises out of this is that can there be a total automation, multiple technological backups, of course, are present when it comes to aviation, but can that prevent any kind of technical faults and subsequent crashes? Because, technology is something that perhaps cannot be flawless, but even with the most advanced of technologies, the best conceptualized by humans, at the end of the day, if they fail, there will be questions as to why. Technology
is very useful and we see it all around us, and in aviation it tends to be more reliable than humans, who are of course the different design philosophy. If you look at Airbus, they believe computers are more reliable than humans. Boeing tends to say, well, look, we'll automate the aircraft a lot, but ultimately the pilots have final control. So there is a difference in design philosophy there, and automation is very useful. Whether this is possible, whether this tragedy could have happened in an Airbus A350, we don't know, but obviously there will be studies done about that in due course.
No, the reason I'm asking this question is that in April 2024, we've seen Boeing engineer Sam raised serious concerns about flaws in the manufacturing process of both the 787 and the 777 models. Now, his complaints focus primarily on alleged shortcuts taken by the company practices. According to him, could significantly reduce the aircraft's structural lifespan and lead to early degradation, potentially putting lives at risk. Considering all of this, what do you say, or what would you say about whether this warrants a closer look about systemic manufacturing flaws that could be at play?
The Boeing whistleblower saga is potentially a relevance here. There is another Boeing whistleblower who was involved in senior capacity in the construction of the 787s, in the United States, including this accident aircraft. He had concerns about the integrity of the manufacturing process. I believe that whistleblowing complaint is still being litigated, but we will be referring to that when we go to the US courts to find out more information from Boeing. It's something the travelling public deserve to know,
right,
and it's something that the families of 171 must know.
Now, there are sections of the Western media that are attempting to use this report, particularly the part involving the cockpit voice recorder, to push their own narrative. In the recording, there's one pilot who asks, "Why did you cut it off?" That is the fuel switches, to which the other says, "I didn't do so." Now, how important is it that we have full details of the conversation between the pilots, and doesn't releasing only part of the conversation risk giving fodder to speculation and misrepresentation about the role of the pilots?
It's been very difficult for the families to just look at snippets of the conversations between the captain and the first officer. We simply have two very short phrases, and then we have the Mayday call. And it is really important that the contents of the CVR, the cockpit voice recorder, are transcribed and that they are released to the families, because that is all a critical part of what happened in that cockpit, and probably related to the chain of causes that resulted in this terrible tragedy.
Now, you've mentioned right at the start the investigation has ruled out several potential factors. There's been a lot of speculation surrounding weather conditions, bird strike, aircraft weight, a balance, and a pre-existing engine issues, whether the flaps were up and down, etc. Considering these eliminations, where should the focus of the investigation now solely be on?
I think the focus is very simple now, which is looking into the history of those fuel cut-off switches, looking into the air in maintenance, specifically in relation to why they decided not to look at an advisory bulletin, and then looking potentially at the training in relation to those two pilots as to how those fuel switches appeared to be transitioned from run to cut off and then back. So we've got a far more precise area now. We just need to do further investigation into them.
Right, and no action has been recommended against Boeing at this stage. Do you believe that's a fair and justified decision at this point in the investigation?
Certainly further investigation has to be done into the history of those fuel control switches. It's interesting that no emergency action has been warranted so far. If you look at the Boeing 737 MAX tragedies, it took some time, and indeed a second accident, for emergency action to be taken. So just because nothing has been said today doesn't mean, by way of an emergency airworthiness directive, it doesn't mean that something may not be said in the weeks and months to come.
What additional data or evidence typically would investigators look for in the next phase of investigation like this to determine the root cause and prevent future occurrences?
I think they'll be looking much more closely at the evidence in relation to the electrical system and the fuel control switches and how that was interacting with the rest of the system. I mean, there are photographs of those on the preliminary report. I think they might also be looking more closely at the contents of the cockpit voice recorder. But you and I don't know what's on that cockpit voice recorder other than 3 short sentences. And we don't even know who said those. And it should be readily comprehensible about who said what to whom on that flight deck.
And lastly, Mr. Pratt, Air India has begun disbursing interim compensation to the families of those affected by the Ahmedabad crash, in addition to the 1 crore compensation announced by Tata Sons. From the legal and aviation accountability standpoint, do you believe that this is an adequate compensation at this stage? How does it compare with international norms in similar cases?
That's only a part of the story. No money's ever going to bring anyone back. I think our families prefer the phrase financial justice. And in our view, there is a claim, certainly by the British families, in the High Court in England against Air India. That is without any financial limit. It's up to the families to prove their financial damages and obtain financial justice. And we also believe there's a case in the United States courts against Boeing. in relation to this area of the fuel control switches. So it's much, much more than just an interim payment under the Montreal Convention and then a gift, an ex gratia payment from the Tata Group.
All right, James Healy-Pratt, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us and sharing with us your analysis of what the preliminary report of the AAIB really suggests. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. And I'd like to thank all of viewers for joining us as well. The news and updates will continue on the other side. Stay tuned.